Hello, the Pioneer viewers. I hope you're healthy and well. Today, we will again analyze the latest developments in the Russia-Ukraine war with a map. As you know, the Ukrainian armed forces have intensified their offensive on the Kherson front line. These offensives are greatly disturbing the integrity of the Russian troops' front line. In addition, the efforts of the Ukrainian troops to expand the front are very important. The expansion of the front by the Ukrainian army makes it very difficult for the Russian army. The advance of the Russian army on the Kherson front line is critical for the fate of the war. We will discuss these developments in our report shortly. We need to emphasize the following. The war is not only intense on the Kherson front line, there are also fierce clashes and new developments in the other regions. So, what is the latest situation on the front line? Let's take a look at the developments together. As the Pioneer team, we continue our report activities on the Russian-Ukrainian war with a great determination. Behind this determination, of course, is your support. We read your comments, and these comments make us very pleased. I will try to include the comments of our viewers who comment here from the time to time. On behalf of myself and my team, I would like to thank you all for all your nice comments. Please continue to express your opinions about our content in the comments. Let's start, if you're ready, the Pioneer report. Let's start our report with the Kherson front line. We mentioned its importance and the intensity of the developments at the beginning of our report. Therefore, we will first focus on what happened on the Kherson front line. As you know, the Ukrainian army has a superiority in the region. We learned this from both Ukrainian and Russian sources. The fact that the Russian sources constantly share panic, including reports, shows that the Ukrainian army still holds their upper hand. When we look at the region, we see that the attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces are concentrated on the Poima, Pechanivka, and Podstepnoye axis. There is quite intense pressure from the Ukrainian artillery on these three areas. This pressure must continue. When we look at the Russian sources, we see that the effect of this pressure is quite high. The more artillery pressure, the more chances of victory. As you may recall, we mentioned earlier that the armored units of the Ukrainian army were trying to be transferred to the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. Russian sources announced today that the transfer of the Ukrainian armed units to the eastern bank of the Dnieper River has been completed. This is a critical development. As you may recall, the biggest problem of the Ukrainian army in the Verbov direction was its armored vehicles could not be fully secured behind the dragon's teeth. However, there is no such a situation here. The Ukrainian army is now on the east bank of the Dnieper River with its armored vehicles. This situation shows that the Russian army is about to face worse days. Let's talk about artillery activity in the region. As you know, Russian artillery units have been targeting Ukrainian positions with long-range artillery for a long time. However, these have not been sufficient so far. Russian sources are already complaining about the insufficiency of the Russian artillery. Today, Russian artillery struck Ukrainian positions in Belzorek, Kherson, Antonivka, Podstepnoye, and Sadovnoye, Taglinka, and Novoborivslav. However, as we have noted, these attacks are insufficient. The Ukrainian armed forces are holding strong both in the newly captured areas and their firmer positions. Ukrainian artillery units have also responded to these attacks by Russian artillery units. According to the latest reports, Ukrainian artillery units targeted Sevastopol, Alyosky, Kazakh's camps, and the Kherson direction. Let's continue by analyzing the latest developments in the Robotny sector of the Zaporizhzhia front line. According to the latest reports, Ukrainian artillery units continue to soften up the Russian positions. There are reports that Ukrainian artillery units are intensively hitting Russian positions, especially in the direction of Novoprokopivka, Kopany, and Verbov. These attacks are critical, but the recent attacks in Verbov direction need to be examined in more detail. According to the latest reports, Ukrainian artillery units are hitting the dominant hills in the direction of Verbov. We have mentioned the importance of this area in our previous reports. A similar situation occurred in Klishchivka. Ukrainian troops must seize the dominant hills here at all costs. If Ukrainian troops seize the dominant hills, we may see more Ukrainian advances in the Verbov area. The most important task here lies with the Ukrainian artillery. The more Ukrainian artillery can soften up Russian positions, the more Ukrainian infantry units can advance. That is why we often talk about the artillery offensive of the Ukrainian army and ammunition support for the Ukrainian army. We can say that the artillery is largely decisive in the Russian-Ukrainian war today. As you may recall, we have mentioned in many of our previous reports that there were confessions of the artillery support by the soldiers of the Russian army. The Russian war leadership does not provide adequate support to its soldiers. This paves the way for the Ukrainian artillery units to fight better in the field. I have already given our impressions on this issue when talking about the Kherson front line. The stronger the Ukrainian artillery units became, the sooner this occupation will end. However, if the Ukrainian artillery units are faced with a loss of strength or a lack of ammunition, this will reduce the Ukrainian army's capacity to advance and, moreover, its defense capacity. Let's talk about artillery activity in the region. Recent reports indicate that long-range weapons of the Russian armed forces targeted Ukrainian armed forces in Pitiakhatki, Malaya Sherbyanki, Robotnyu, Malaya Tokmakcha, and Belogorivka region. In return, Ukrainian artillery units targeted Russian troops in Novoprokopivka, Kopani, Verbov, Nesryanka, Rivne, Ichenko, and Novopokrovka. Let's continue by analyzing the latest developments on the Donetsk front line. On this front line, the offensive of the Russian army continues. The traditional Marinka offensive by the Russian troops continued, but there is no result. Now let's continue by addressing our main issue. In Pervomayevsky, too, there are intensive offensive of the Russian army. However, as we mentioned, the lack of Russian artillery is the biggest obstacle to the successes of the Russian infantry units. Ukrainian defense forces are fighting a very successful defensive battle in both areas. No disruption of the Ukrainian positions has been recorded so far. The Ukrainian army launched an offensive in the northeast of the Vodyatny with artillery support. During these attacks, Ukrainian forces managed to recapture some of the positions that had lost. Russian positions in the area were repelled. It is also reported that the Russian troops suffered heavy losses during this offensive. Let's talk about artillery activity in the region. According to the latest report, Ukrainian artillery units targeted Russian positions in Donetsk, Opitny, Kamenka, and the village of Krasnogorovka. The attacks of the Russian artillery are rather weak, so we don't include them in our report. What do you think? Do you think Russian troops will be able to break Ukrainian pressure on the Kherson front line? And do you think Ukrainian army's pressure here is sufficient? What do you think about the entire front line? Tell us in the comments. I read and care about all your comments.